Okay, let's get straight on now. Last Thursday, the delayed Monetary Policy Committee meeting happened at the Bank of England. It was delayed, of course, because of the Queen's funeral, but they announced that they would be decreasing the asset purchase programme by £80 billion. So that's quantitative easing, otherwise known. So they're going to reduce that by £80 billion. Today, unfortunately, they've had to reverse that decision and a bit more. So this was the press release issued by the Bank of England just an hour or so ago. And what are they saying? Well, here's the key paragraph. To achieve this, the bank will carry out, and this is to achieve what they describe as stability in the markets with respect to bonds. To achieve this, the bank will carry out temporary purchases of long-dated UK government bonds from the 20th of September. The purpose of these purchases will be to restore orderly market conditions. The purchases will be carried out on whatever scale is necessary to achieve this outcome. The operation will be fully indemnified by Her Majesty's Treasury. So they may be the standard quantitative easing, they may be reducing that by £80 billion, but they are basically deciding, David, to increase it again under these particular circumstances by as much as they feel like in order to restore what they describe as orderly conduct. But of course, the taxpayer underwrites that.
Taxpayer always underwrites quantitative easing. Not a lot of people actually know that, Mike, but the taxpayer has underwritten it all. Any losses from this process are paid for by you, me, and everyone watching. Isn't that wonderful? And yes, it's a temporary programme. And just like when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, that also was a temporary measure. And we'll see how long this one lasts.
Well, the government statement said, I just want to highlight this, the Chancellor authorised the Governor's request for an indemnity for the operation, which will in turn ensure that financial conditions remain accessible for households and businesses. How believable is that statement?
Well, it's nothing to do with households and businesses. This is just nonsense. It's to do with the fact that government debt was becoming rapidly unstable and unaffordable. It spiked up from, a couple of years ago, government debt was well under percent. It was almost nothing. They were getting the money for nothing. And it spiked up to 5% on the 30-year, 4.5% on the 10-year gilt, and it was becoming a big problem. So they stepped in to prevent that. They're monetising the debt. The government's, in one hand, via the Treasury, buying the debt, and the other hand, it's generating the debt. It's entirely circular, and it's for their interests, not ours. Of course, if the entire system collapses, they are right to point, and this is how it's always done, they point at Main Street and say, it's going to get you, we're only operating on your behalf. That's how it was done in 2007. That's why there was a $750 billion bailout of the banks then, with a gun held to the head of the American people.
Well, we'll come on to the effect that this is going to have on people in a second. Before we get to that, let's look at some more information. So here we've got UK 10-year gilts. And the graph shows quite clearly how that has gone in the last period of time, and the same for the US Treasury bonds.
Yeah, although not quite as dramatic, something similar is happening in America. You see the US Treasury 10-year bonds are up to nearly 4%. 10-year gilts at this point was 4.4. It's just over 4.1% now. And if we go to the next chart, I was having a look at how the yield curve was. Now you see the blue line here for the United States yield curve. This is how much the United States is paying for different ages of debt. And you see, very unusually, it's sloping downwards. It's cheaper for the United States to borrow money for 40 years than it is to borrow money for 2 years. This is called an inverted yield curve and is very interesting. And you see how that's happened recently within the last 6 months. And I thought I'd check out Italy. There's a lot of news about Italy today, and we'll cover some of that later. And we see it's also got an inverted yield curve, which made me wonder just how many countries do have an inverted yield curve? And the answer is lots. Lots and lots. In fact, here we have 19 countries, including the United Kingdom, have an inverted yield curve. And what does this mean? It's often considered a predictor of economic recession.
Yes, well, in fact, the bank already believes we are in an economic recession, but it gets pretty bad when even for a first world country anyway, when even the International Monetary Fund is urging caution?
Well, this was a little bit ironic. So the IMF decided that the tax cuts announced by the Liz Truss government were really unacceptable and warned against them stoking inflation, really. So they said they launched a biting attack on the UK's plan to implement 45 billion of debt-funded tax cuts, urging the government to reevaluate the plan, and said that the untargeted package threatens to stoke soaring inflation. And they were very hard-hitting about it. They said it's important that fiscal policy does not work at cross purposes with monetary policy. Well, okay, fair enough. Brian Deese, director of White House National Economic Council, said he wasn't surprised by the reaction to the UK's fiscal plan, saying it puts the central bank in a position of having to potentially to move even tighter. Well, he was exactly wrong about that, wasn't he? But that's the IMF for you. This is 24 hours. It's a long time in the world of the IMF. He added it's particularly important to maintain a focus on fiscal prudence. Where have we heard that one before? Mr. Brown, he's gone but not forgotten. Now, Eswar Prasad, former senior IMF official, said it's a hard-hitting, pointed criticism, pulls few punches. It's as close as IMF language comes to calling a set of policies irresponsible, ill-advised and ill-timed. On the subject of irresponsible, ill-advised and ill-timed, I give you what all of the central bankers have been doing to our money supply for the last 10 years. This is a chart of M1 in the United Kingdom, so that's cash, coins, bank deposits, overnight deposits, and here we have a chart that goes from 2012 up to present date, and you see that the money supply has more than doubled. So the bankers double the money supply, and they're saying, "Oh, it's the tax cuts that are going to cause the inflation. Oh, you shouldn't do tax cuts." Well, really, I'm not entirely convinced by that one, Mike. Are you?
Not 1 second. Of course, if you take a longer term look at it, it's even worse. But anyway, let's move on.
Well, I was saying to you, Mike, the other day that what Liz Truss was doing was essentially a rerun of Reaganomics, and I thought it'd be worth just touching base on what that actually was in practice. Here we have an old article from Murray Rothbard, the great economist. He says, "I come to bury Reaganomics, not to praise it." And he looks at how they've achieved their own goals. In general terms, Reagan pledged to return or advance to a free market and to get government off our backs. That was the promise. How did they do? Well, he called for massive cuts in government spending, drastic cuts in taxation, a balanced budget by 1984, because that spendthrift Jimmy Carter had a budget deficit of $74 billion, a return to the gold standard, as well as lots of other free market laissez-faire policies. So the first thing that went was the gold standard pledge. President Reagan appointed an allegedly impartial commission to study the problem because they're independent. A commission overwhelmingly packed with lifelong opponents of the gold standard found that the gold standard wasn't to be reintroduced, so that one killed that pledge. On government spending, the last year of government spending under Jimmy Carter, the government spent $591 billion. The last year of the Reagan administration, $990 billion, an increase of 68%. So slashing government spending, no. Deficits, we're going to slash deficits. Jimmy Carter had deficits of a horrendous $40 to $50 billion, and Reagan was promised to achieve a balanced budget. And under Reagan, the deficit settled down to around $200 billion. And Rothbard concludes, all of this, along with the universal misperception of Reaganomics, illustrates once more the wisdom of those incisive political philosophers, Gilbert and Sullivan, quote, "Things are not always what they seem. Skim milk masquerades as cream." You gotta love Murray Rothbard.
Okay, so the question is, how attractive is gold at the moment?
Well, I put this in to illustrate just what the problem is with the money supply and the importance of 1971 when the last remnants of the gold standard was carried away. This chart shows London house prices. 1968 is indexed as 1, and we're now approaching 120 in sterling terms. So house prices in London have risen 120 times since 1968 in sterling. Look at the gold-coloured line. That's the price in gold. It hasn't budged. House prices haven't gone up. The houses haven't become unaffordable. We've become poorer.
Yes.
Because the money has been devalued and we haven't noticed because it's happened gradually.
Okay, keep going.
Okay, right. So we've got here a wee bit more information about what's actually happening in the markets. This is a dollar Japan yen chart, right? So it used to be a year ago or so, we had 108 yen to get a dollar. Now it's 144. So the yen is plummeting. They've still got interest rates stuck at 0.25% by government policy. The euro's the same. The euro's plummeted from $1.18 to 95 cents. So the euro's going down. And the British pound chart is very odd because it was going up, right? And then all of a sudden it went off a cliff. That doesn't look like a genuine market move to me. It doesn't strike me as something that's actually related to market forces. That seems to me to be as much a political move as anything else. It's clear that the powers that be, the IMF and elsewhere, do not want tax cuts. That's not on their agenda. And we've got here one other market that's worth looking at is a thing called the repo market. It's a sign of trouble if it starts to go wrong. Brookings here explains what it is. A repo, a repurchase agreement, is a short-term secured loan. One party sells securities like treasury bills, gilts and things like that to another and agrees to repurchase those securities later at a higher price. The securities serve as collateral. The difference between the security's initial price and the repurchase price is the interest paid on the loan, known as the repo rate, right? So these are very short-term, often overnight, very large volume loans between financial institutions that basically oil the wheels of the banking system. So how's that going? Well, it was sitting at near zero and it started to shoot up to around 3%, as you see in this graph here. Taking a slightly longer timeline, we see, well, that's up to where it was around about 2019. When there was a huge spike, that's when the repo market basically locked up and there wasn't enough liquidity in the system, and the Fed stepped in to print a ton of money to stop the market crashing and having another banking liquidity crisis. And if you look at an even longer timeline, you can see here the stack up to that crisis in 2019. You can see the stack up, which was the housing bubble, coming up to the crash quite clearly on that chart. And you also see the effect of 9/11 and all the money printing around 9/11. So it's a very interesting chart. It shows what's been happening in a geopolitical and economic terms. And it also shows that something is happening now. So it's one to watch.
Okay, David, a question from me. Who is controlling this this system? We've got stuff happening across nation states. We could say it's globalist. Is it the politicians in control of the money, or have we got another group of people who are controlling money production, the money supply?
Well, at the moment in the UK, the Bank of England is printing money on behalf of the government. So in the short term, locally, it's just government monetization of debt. In the longer term, there's clearly people at international level, if you want to call them a deep state, in places like the IMF that have a different policy, and they've got an agenda. But of course, finding out exactly what that is notoriously difficult. But it clearly doesn't tally with the current Liz Truss Kwasi Kwarteng administration agenda and policy. And then you've got the Fed doing what they're doing, which is actually tightening quite a lot. They're driving the dollar up to enormous levels, very, very high levels. That's going to turn soon. and there will be a huge drop there too. What you're seeing is a great deal of instability. When there's instability, there's political instability, and that obviously promotes change and dismantling of existing systems. This is what we've got to look out for.
Okay, so in my mind, the key question is, are the politicians driving the banks or the banks driving the politicians? And I'm going to suggest it's the latter.
Well, let's bring the Bank of England back on then, because we've got nothing to worry about. Here's Andrew Bailey saying the Monetary Policy Committee will not hesitate to change interest rates by as much as needed to return inflation to the 2% target sustainably in the medium term. So that was put out literally about 2 hours before they pushed out their notification of the money printing. But the question is, what impact is this having on ordinary people? And let's bring in a few tweets here. So here is one saying, nothing helps you tackle your rising food and energy bills like your mortgage doubling overnight. The UK is in effing parity. And I thought this was because, of course, people are now in a position where they're saying mortgages being withdrawn from the markets, from the lenders, which means that people that are on fixed rate mortgage, 2 or 5 year fixed rate mortgages, have to remortgage in the very near future, and they're suddenly finding that the products are not available and the prices are going up hugely. The next one here, if you listen very carefully, you can actually hear the housing chains collapsing across the UK. This is absolutely correct. This is going to have a fairly major effect on many, many people, and already we're seeing people commenting about them having put their house on the market, and suddenly they're not getting any viewings anymore because the mortgages aren't available. And the next one here, there might be a housing market crash, but look on the bright side, the millionaires have just been given a massive tax cut, so they'll be able to hoover up all the cheaper houses and rent them back to the people who lose theirs.
And that comment is spot on.
I would say so, but let's move on, because the next question is, what is the impact going to be on people's lives? Well, let's consider the issue of food. And if you remember on Monday's program, I was making the point that the UK is already importing, or has for many years imported, well over 50% of its food. And as we were making the point, if you're a vegetarian or vegan, in fact, it's much higher. If you're a vegan, it's more like 80% of the food that you need is imported. So let's bring this on. It's actually a Reuters report on this particular publication. European farmers warn of shortages due to energy crisis. And I think this is perhaps the most concerning aspect of this. So here's a quote from a French farmer. In 2021, we paid 100,000 euros for electricity. This year, we will pay not far from 200,000 euros. And today, the proposal I got is 750,000 euros per year, provided I sign for 3 years. That is to say, I'm asked to pay 2.2 million euros to my energy supplier. And David, the farmers in Europe are already saying that they will stop production, and this has got to be probably the most concerning aspect of this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, look at Iceland as an example. This is where, Brian, the idea that it's the bankers is too narrow an interpretation. Iceland were 90-odd%, 95% independent in food production, mostly under glass, generated from geothermal and other heat sources. And they decided that this wasn't on. They weren't going to have all these glass houses. The government decided it wasn't eco-friendly, and basically taxed and them out of existence. And now they're 95% food importers. They're no longer independent in food. And this was a state policy driven by the green agenda. So there's many sources for this, but the some of the sources are embedded in government, some of the sources are embedded in banks and international organizations like the IMF, and some of the sources are embedded in tax-exempt foundations. That network remains very difficult to identify.
Of course, but those networks are themselves dependent on money in order to do what they do. Let's remember there was the statement from the Bank of England, I think, which said, if you don't adopt the green agenda policies, we will...
That was Mark Carney, yes, indeed.
We will put you out of business.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a
absolutely.
lot of questions at the moment.
Okay, well, let's move on to the Donbass.